Welcome, dear listeners. As you settle in for the night, let the world around you fade away. Tonight, we journey to the Silver Mountains, where a majestic griffin named Alien guards the legendary crystal of healing. With its power sought by those who seek greed, Alien stands watch, ready to protect the magic within. Close your eyes and let the soothing tale of the griffin's guardian guide you into a peaceful slumber. In the highest peaks of the Silver Mountains, where the mist curled around jagged cliffs and the air was thin and cold, a creature of legend stood watch. Its massive form, both lion and eagle, was a sight to behold. Feathered wings stretched wide, golden eyes glowing with ancient knowledge, and talons sharp enough to cleave stone. This was Alien, the Griffin of the Peaks, and for centuries it had guarded the most sacred of treasures, the crystal of healing. The crystal lay deep within a hidden cave, nestled among rocks that shimmered faintly with the soft glow of magic. No mortal hand had touched it in 1,000 years, for Alien allowed no one to pass. The crystal of healing, a gem no larger than a man's fist, glowed with an inner light that pulsed softly, like the steady beat of a heart. Its power was unmatched, capable of healing any wound, curing any illness, and even mending a heart broken by sorrow. Yet it was not meant for kings or conquerors. The ancient guardians had entrusted it to Alien, knowing that the griffin's fierce loyalty and wisdom would protect it from the hands of those who sought to misuse its power. The mountain winds howled around the griffin as it perched on a high ridge, its gaze sweeping the lands below. Alien's golden eyes caught every movement in the valley, every flutter of leaves, every shift of shadow. But even in its vigilance, there was a deep loneliness that weighed heavy on the griffin's heart. It had lived for centuries, outliving the mortals it had once known, watching over the world in silent solitude. The crystal of healing was a burden, but one Alien bore with pride, for the world needed its power to remain safe from the greed of men. The legend of the crystal had spread across the kingdoms, whispered in the courts of kings and in the fireside tales of peasants. Many had tried to find it, to claim its magic for themselves, but none had succeeded. The Silver Mountains were perilous, and Alien's presence deterred all but the most foolish. The griffin had driven off warriors, sorcerers, and thieves alike, leaving them battered and broken at the base of the mountains. Yet, despite these victories, Alien knew that there would always be another who sought the crystal's power. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the mountains in shades of purple and gold, Alien felt a stirring in the air, a sense of unease that it had not felt in many years. The wind whispered of distant troubles, of a force moving across the land, growing closer with each passing day. Alien's wings rustled uneasily, its talons scraping against the stone beneath it. There was a new threat coming, and this one felt different. This one felt dangerous. Far below the mountains, hidden from the griffin's view, lay the kingdom of Eldorn. It was a land of green fields, sprawling forests, and a people who lived in both fear and awe of their ruler, King Roderick. The king's hunger for power was known far and wide, and he had long searched for ways to extend his reign beyond mortal limits. The crystal of healing had become his obsession, and now, after years of searching, his spies had finally brought him a map that led to the Silver Mountains and the griffin's lair. Alien did not yet know of King Roderick's plan, but the griffin's instincts were sharp. Something was coming, something that would test its strength and the magic it guarded. As the stars began to twinkle in the cold night sky, The Griffin turned its gaze back toward the entrance of the cave. The crystal of healing pulsed softly within, a beacon of light in the darkness. "I will protect you," Alien whispered, though there was no one to hear but the wind. "As I always have." And so, the Griffin kept its vigil, unaware that far below, a journey was beginning, one that would bring both danger and an unlikely ally to its side. In the kingdom of Eldorn, King Roderick sat upon his gilded throne, his fingers tapping restlessly on the armrest. The grand hall of the castle, adorned with tapestries of past conquests and lined with towering marble pillars, was silent, but for the murmurs of the court advisors standing nearby. Their faces were pale, eyes downcast, as they dared not speak until the king gave them leave. For King Roderick was not a man of patience, nor mercy. His hunger for power had grown over the years, and so had his cruelty. The king's gaze was fixed on a scroll lying unfurled on the table before him, a map, old and worn, but marked with the unmistakable outline of the Silver Mountains. His eyes gleamed with greed as he traced the path leading to a single spot deep in the heart of the range. A spot that his spies had assured him was the resting place of the legendary Crystal of Healing. "So it is true," Roderick murmured, his voice low and dangerous. "The crystal exists, and it is within my grasp." He stood abruptly, the sudden movement startling the advisors. His long cloak of crimson and gold swept behind him as he paced across the room, his thoughts racing. Roderick had always feared his own mortality. The years had not been kind to him, and though his kingdom flourished under his rule, his own body had begun to fail. He had heard whispers in the corridors of the castle, whispers of his weakness, his age. He could not allow such things to undermine his reign, not when immortality was so close. "The Griffin," said one of the advisors, daring to speak at last, "is said to be the guardian of the crystal, a beast of immense power, my lord. Few who have sought the artifact have returned." Roderick's lip curled in disdain. "A beast, you say? It is nothing more than an animal, albeit a large one. Animals can be broken, tamed, or killed." The advisor winced but remained silent. Roderick's confidence was unshakable, but the stories of Alien, the Griffin of the Peaks, were enough to unsettle even the bravest of men. Tales of the Griffin's might, its swift wings, and deadly talons had been passed down through generations. But to Roderick, these were just the ramblings of fools who had failed. He, on the other hand, would not fail. He would take what he desired, just as he always had. "Prepare my army," Roderick commanded, his voice cold and sharp. "We march at dawn." The advisors hesitated. One of them, an older man with a face lined from years of service, stepped forward cautiously. "My king," he began, "the Silver Mountains are treacherous, and the journey will be long. Perhaps we should gather more information, send scouts to confirm." Roderick's eyes flashed with fury, and he slammed his fist down on the table, rattling the map and scattering scrolls. "Enough!" he thundered. "I will not wait while time slips through my fingers. I will have the Crystal of Healing, and I will not allow some winged creature to stand in my way." The advisors bowed deeply, fear etched into their faces. None dared to oppose the king further. As they scurried to make preparations, Roderick turned back to the map, his heart racing with anticipation. The Crystal of Healing, its power could be his. With it, he could extend his life indefinitely. He would no longer fear the slow decay of age, nor the inevitable hand of death. His reign would be eternal. As the castle prepared for war, news of the king's plan spread like wildfire. The people of Eldorn, already burdened by high taxes and conscriptions, whispered anxiously in the streets. They had heard the stories of the Silver Mountains and the Griffin that lived there, and many feared that no good could come from angering such a creature. But fear of King Roderick was greater still, and none dared speak out against him. That night, the moon hung low over Eldorn, casting a cold silver light over the land. In the king's chambers, Roderick gazed out across his kingdom, imagining the future that awaited him. An immortal king ruling forever over his subjects. He could almost feel the crystal's magic in his hands. But far away, beyond the kingdom's borders, high in the mist-shrouded mountains, aliens stirred. The Griffin's golden eyes snapped open, sensing the approach of a great threat. The winds carried a whisper of steel and ambition, and the crystal of healing pulsed faintly in its cave, as if in warning. The battle for the artifact was about to begin. The village of Briarwood lay nestled at the edge of the kingdom, far from the luxury of King Roderick's castle, but close enough to feel the weight of his rule. The people of Briarwood lived humble lives, tending their fields and raising livestock. But in recent years, the king's demands had grown harsher. Taxes rose with each season, and many of the young men had been conscripted into his ever-growing army, leaving the village with fewer hands to till the soil. Elara, a peasant girl no older than 20, had lived her whole life in Briarwood. Her father, once a soldier, had returned from one of the king's wars with a limp and a bitter heart. He would often tell Elara stories of the world beyond their village, tales of brave knights, magical creatures, and ancient treasures. But lately, his stories had turned to darker topics, whispering of the king's cruelty and his insatiable thirst for power. One evening, as Elara made her way home from the fields, she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. Two of the king's soldiers, their armor clinking as they rode through the village, were speaking in hushed tones. She ducked behind a thicket of trees, her heart pounding as she listened. "The king leaves tomorrow at dawn," one of the soldiers muttered. "He's after the crystal of healing." Elara's breath caught. The crystal of healing. She had heard the stories. It was said to have the power to heal any wound, cure any illness. But more than that, it was said to be guarded by a creature of legend. A griffin whose talons could tear through armies and whose wings could blot out the sun. "Does he really think he can take it?" the other soldier scoffed. "That griffin will tear him apart before he even lays eyes on it." The first soldier grunted. "The king's not going to let some beast stop him. He's bringing the whole army. If the griffin won't yield, he'll kill it. And when the king has the crystal in his hands, well, no one will be able to challenge him." Elara's heart pounded in her chest. She knew the cruelty of King Roderick, how he had bled the kingdom dry with his wars and his greed. If he claimed the crystal of healing, there would be no stopping him. The artifact's power could keep him on the throne forever, his reign of terror unending. As the soldiers rode away, Elara remained hidden, her thoughts racing. She couldn't allow this to happen. Someone had to stop the king, to warn the griffin. But who? No one in the village would dare stand against Roderick. They were too afraid, too beaten down by years of oppression. Her own father had grown silent, weary from his time in the king's service. There was no one else, except her. Elara straightened, a sense of determination settling over her. She was no warrior, no knight in shining armor, but she had something else, courage and a fierce sense of right and wrong. The crystal of healing wasn't meant for a greedy king. Its magic belonged to the world, to those who would use it for good. She couldn't sit idly by while King Roderick destroyed everything in his path. That night, Elara packed a small bag of provisions, some bread, a flask of water, and the simple dagger her father had given her when she was a child. It was a meager weapon, but it would have to do. As she fastened the cloak around her shoulders, her father's voice stopped her at the door. "Elara," he said, his voice rough with weariness. "Where are you going?" She hesitated, knowing he wouldn't understand. "I'm going to the Silver Mountains." His brow furrowed in confusion. "Why, girl? What business do you have there?" She couldn't bring herself to tell him the truth, to burden him with the weight of what she was about to do. "I have to," she said softly, her voice steady. "I have to stop something terrible." Her father's eyes lingered on her for a moment, as if he saw in her the same fire that had once burned in him. He didn't ask any more questions. Instead, he simply nodded and said, "Be careful." With that, Elara set off into the night, her footsteps quiet on the dirt path that led out of the village. The moonlight guided her as she made her way toward the distant peaks of the Silver Mountains, the weight of her decision heavy on her shoulders. She didn't know what awaited her there, or if she could truly stop King Roderick. But she knew one thing: she had to try. As the stars twinkled above, Elara felt a flicker of hope in her heart. Perhaps, somewhere in those mountains, the Griffin would understand that she came not as an enemy, but as an ally. Together, they might just have a chance. As dawn broke over the kingdom of Eldorn, King Roderick's army stood ready. Rows upon rows of soldiers clad in iron and steel filled the castle courtyard, their armor gleaming in the early morning light. Banners bearing the king's crest, an eagle clutching a sword, flapped in the wind, and the sound of hooves echoed through the stone streets as the king's war horses were prepared for the long journey ahead. King Roderick himself, seated atop his black stallion, surveyed his forces with a cruel smile. The Silver Mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks shrouded in mist, but Roderick felt no fear. He had amassed an army large enough to crush anything that stood in his way, even the mythical Griffin that guarded the crystal of healing. His enchanted sword, forged by the finest smiths in the kingdom and imbued with dark magic, hung at his side. With it, he believed no foe could stand against him. "Onward!" Roderick bellowed, raising his sword high. The soldiers cheered, their voices a chorus of steel and power as they began their march toward the mountains. The king's army moved like a great serpent across the land, winding its way through forests and hills, trampling everything in its path. Villagers along the way cowered in their homes, peeking through shutters as the soldiers passed, fearful of what the king's ambitions might bring. Word spread quickly of the king's quest for the crystal, and rumors of the Griffin's wrath followed close behind. The journey was long, and as they neared the base of the Silver Mountains, the air grew colder, the trees sparser. The once lush landscape gave way to rocky cliffs and jagged peaks, where the wind howled like a ghost. Yet King Roderick remained undeterred. His soldiers, though weary, marched onward under the lash of their commanders, knowing that failure was not an option. At last, they reached the foothills of the Silver Mountains. The path upward was steep and treacherous, winding through narrow passes and over crumbling ledges. The soldiers muttered among themselves, casting uneasy glances at the skies. They had all heard the stories of the Griffin. a beast with the body of a lion and the wings of an eagle, its eyes burning with ancient wisdom and power. Many had hoped the stories were nothing more than fables, but now, standing at the edge of the Griffin's domain, fear began to creep into their hearts. King Roderick, however, was blind to such fear. His eyes were fixed on the summit, where he believed the crystal of healing awaited him. The thought of its power made his blood race with excitement. He would not let a mere beast stand between him and his destiny. "Forward!" he commanded, spurring his horse up the rocky trail. The army followed, their footsteps echoing against the cliffs. As they climbed higher, the air grew thin and cold, and the mist thickened around them. Soon, they were enveloped in a heavy fog, their visibility limited to mere feet ahead. But even in the swirling mist, Roderick's determination did not falter. High above, hidden among the clouds, Elian watched. The Griffin's golden eyes narrowed as it observed the king's army advancing up the mountainside. The scent of steel and blood tainted the pure air of the peaks, and the sound of clinking armor reached Elian's ears like an ominous drumbeat. It had known this day would come, a day when greed would drive men to seek the power of the crystal of healing. But Elian had never imagined such arrogance, such audacity from a single man. With a mighty flap of its wings, the Griffin descended from its perch, gliding silently through the mist. Its powerful body moved with the grace of a predator, each beat of its wings stirring the air as it drew closer to the intruders. Elian's talons gleamed in the pale light, sharp as blades, ready to strike. For centuries, it had protected the crystal, and it would not allow the likes of King Roderick to take what did not belong to him. Suddenly, the fog parted, and the king's army came into view. Elian's shadow loomed over them, vast and dark, as it swooped down from the heights. The soldiers looked up in terror, their cries of alarm echoing through the mountains. "Hold your ground!" Roderick roared, drawing his sword. His voice cut through the chaos, and the soldiers, though shaken, readied their weapons. The Griffin landed before them with a thundering crash, its wings outstretched, its golden eyes glowing with fury. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the sound of the wind and the distant rumble of falling rocks. The soldiers hesitated, fear coursing through them. They had never faced a creature like this, a being of legend, of raw power. King Roderick, however, felt no such hesitation. His enchanted sword gleamed with a dark light as he raised it, stepping forward to face the Griffin. "Elian!" he called, his voice filled with arrogance. "I have come for the crystal. Stand aside, or be destroyed." The Griffin's eyes flashed, and in that moment, Elian knew that this king was not like the others who had come before. This one would not be easily turned away, but the Griffin was not afraid. With a mighty roar, Elian lunged at the king, talons extended, wings beating the air like thunder. The battle for the crystal of healing had begun. The clash between King Roderick's army and Elian echoed across the mountains, a symphony of metal on stone, wings on wind, and the furious roars of battle. Yet, despite the strength of the king's forces, the Griffin fought with a power born not only of its immense size and strength, but of its centuries-old purpose, to protect the crystal of healing. The soldiers, though many, were no match for the creature's speed and ferocity. Elian's wings beat against the mist, scattering it like smoke, and its talons struck with precision, cutting through armor as if it were paper. Each time the soldiers attempted to strike, the Griffin moved with the grace of an eagle and the force of a lion. their blows finding only air. With a single swipe of its massive wings, Alien sent a row of knights tumbling down the rocky slopes, their cries lost in the wind. But even as it fought, Alien's heart grew heavy with sorrow. The Griffin had guarded the crystal for generations, a duty entrusted to it by the ancient guardians. It had always known that one day someone would come for the crystal, not to seek healing, but to claim it for their own greed. And that day had come in the form of King Roderick, whose ambitions threatened to unravel the fragile balance between magic and mortals. High above the battlefield, on a narrow ledge overlooking the carnage, Elara watched with wide eyes. She had arrived just in time to see the Griffin descend upon the king's army, its majestic form slicing through the mist like a living legend. The sheer power of the creature left her breathless, but it was the battle itself that filled her with dread. She had known the king would bring his army, but the sight of so many men being cut down by the Griffin's might was more than she had imagined. Elara's heart pounded in her chest as she realized the danger Alien faced. The Griffin was strong, yes, but even it could not hold off an entire army forever. The soldiers continued to press forward, their numbers seemingly endless, and at the center of it all stood King Roderick, his dark sword raised, waiting for the moment to strike. As Elara crouched on the ledge, hidden from view, she felt an overwhelming sense of urgency. She had come all this way, risking everything, because she knew the crystal of healing must not fall into the king's hands. But now, seeing the Griffin fighting alone, she knew she had to do more than just watch. The king would not stop until he had the crystal, and Alien could not protect it alone. Determined, Elara climbed down from her perch, making her way toward the battle. Her heart raced with fear, but she knew what she had to do. She couldn't stand by while the Griffin, her only chance of stopping the king, was overwhelmed. As she approached the battlefield, she saw it, the moment of weakness. Alien had just struck down a group of soldiers when, out of the corner of its eye, it saw King Roderick advancing. The king moved with a deadly grace, his enchanted sword raised high, its blade shimmering with dark magic. Alien tried to turn, but the weariness of battle had begun to take its toll. The Griffin's wings faltered for a split second, and in that moment, Roderick struck. With a cry of triumph, the king's sword slashed across the Griffin's side, cutting deep into its flank. Alien let out a roar of pain, its wings faltering as it staggered back. The Griffin's golden eyes, once filled with fiery defiance, now dimmed with the weight of injury. Elara gasped as she saw the Griffin fall. Blood, dark and thick, stained the rocks beneath it. The mighty creature that had seemed so invincible was now vulnerable, wounded by the king's treachery. For a moment, the battlefield fell silent, as if even the wind held its breath. But the silence was short-lived. King Roderick stepped forward, his face twisted into a grin of victory. He raised his sword again, ready to deliver the final blow. Alien, weakened and bleeding, struggled to rise, its wings quivering with effort. The Griffin's breath came in ragged gasps, and for the first time in centuries, it knew fear. It had failed. The crystal of healing would be lost. "No!" Elara's voice rang out across the battlefield, cutting through the din of battle like a bell. She rushed forward, throwing herself between the king and the Griffin, her arms spread wide. "Stop! You cannot do this!" Roderick's eyes narrowed as he looked at the peasant girl standing before him, her courage both foolish and admirable. "And who are you," he sneered, "to defy a king?" Elara's hands trembled, but she stood firm, her heart pounding with fear and resolve. "I am no one," she said, her voice steady despite the terror in her chest. "But this creature has done nothing but protect the world from your greed. The crystal of healing is not meant for you." Roderick's grin faded, replaced by a cold, dangerous glare. "Stand aside, girl, or you will share its fate." But Elara did not move. Behind her, Alien struggled to rise, its golden eyes filled with pain and gratitude. The Griffin had fought for so long, but now it would need the bravery of a peasant to survive. Elara stood in the shadow of King Roderick's blade, her heart racing as she met his cold gaze. The mountain winds whipped her hair around her face, but she held her ground, determined not to let fear win. Behind her, Alien lay bleeding, the once mighty Griffin struggling to stand, its wings quivering with the effort. The soldiers, witnessing the king's looming triumph, held their breath as they awaited his next command. "Step aside, girl," Roderick growled, his voice thick with impatience. "This is not your battle." Elara's pulse quickened, but she shook her head, standing her ground between the king and the wounded Griffin. "It's not just about battle," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "You don't understand what you're trying to take. The crystal of healing wasn't meant for the likes of you. It was meant to help those in need, not to be hoarded by a greedy king." Roderick's lips curled into a sneer. "Spare me your peasant's wisdom. Do you think your words mean anything to me? That crystal will be mine, and I will not be stopped by a girl with foolish dreams." Elara swallowed hard, but something deep within her sparked to life. She hadn't come all this way, hadn't risked everything, just to watch the world fall into the hands of a tyrant. She thought of her village, of the people who suffered under the king's rule, and of the Griffin, a creature whose only purpose was to protect something greater than itself. Elara knew that if she did nothing now, Roderick's greed would destroy more than just the crystal. It would consume the kingdom. She turned and knelt beside Alien, her hand resting gently on the Griffin's blood-streaked feathers. The creature's eyes, glowing faintly with pain, met hers, and for a moment, there was an understanding between them. Elara had no magic, no strength like the Griffin's, but she had something just as powerful, courage and a heart that saw beyond greed. "I'm here to help you," she whispered to Alien. "We have to stop him together." The Griffin let out a low rumble, its breathing labored. It was weak, and the wound from the king's blade had drained much of its strength. But in its golden eyes, there was still a spark of defiance. Alien was not ready to surrender. "Elara!" Roderick's voice rang out sharp and impatient. "Enough of this! Do you think your kindness will stop me? The crystal belongs to me!" Elara rose to her feet and faced the king once more. "The crystal belongs to no one," she said firmly. "Its power was never meant to be owned. If you take it by force, it will destroy you." Roderick laughed, a cruel and bitter sound. "Destroy me? A mere crystal? You are even more foolish than I thought. Step aside, or I will cut you down where you stand." For a moment, the weight of those words hung in the air, heavy and final. Elara could feel the eyes of the soldiers upon her, waiting to see if she would falter. Her heart raced in her chest, and she felt the sting of fear tighten around her, but she did not move. "You can't win this battle," she said softly, though her words carried through the wind. "The Griffin and I, we aren't fighting for power. We're fighting for something much greater. And if you don't see that, then you're the one who's already lost." King Roderick's eyes darkened with anger, and he gripped his sword tighter. "So be it," he snarled, stepping forward with the intent to strike. But before he could bring his sword down, a sound cut through the tension, a low, rumbling growl that made the very earth tremble. Alien, wounded but not defeated, rose to its feet behind Elara. The griffin's wings unfurled, and despite its injury, the creature stood tall and proud, its golden eyes burning with renewed fury. Alien's roar echoed across the mountains, a sound of both defiance and warning, shaking the very stones beneath their feet. Roderick hesitated, his eyes widening at the sight of the griffin standing strong once more. He had expected the beast to be broken, but instead it rose with the strength of something far older, far more powerful than he had anticipated. Elara, standing beside Alien, felt a surge of hope. She wasn't alone in this fight. The griffin had not given up, and neither would she. Together they could still stop the king, but time was running out. "Please," she said, her voice softer now as she addressed Roderick. "Let this end here. The crystal's power isn't something you can control. You'll only bring ruin upon yourself and the kingdom if you take it." For a brief moment, Roderick's gaze flickered with uncertainty. He looked from Elara to the griffin, and then to the mountain cave where the crystal of healing lay hidden. But his greed, deeply rooted and unshakable, tightened its grip on him once more. He raised his sword, eyes blazing with defiance. "The crystal will be mine!" he shouted, lunging forward. Elara braced herself, but she knew this battle wasn't over, not yet. King Roderick's cry rang out like a clap of thunder, and with a swift motion he lunged at Elara, sword raised high. The enchanted blade gleamed with a sinister light, its dark magic ready to strike. Elara, heart pounding in her chest, stepped back instinctively, but she did not flee. She knew she couldn't outrun a king, not here, not now. Just as Roderick's blade descended, a flash of golden feathers blocked the blow. Alien, with all its remaining strength, had thrown itself between Elara and the king. The griffin's talons clashed against the sword with a deafening ring, sending sparks flying into the misty air. Roderick staggered back, his eyes wide with shock. For a moment, the king and the beast stood face to face, the tension between them crackling like lightning in the sky. Alien roared, the sound shaking the very stones beneath their feet. The griffin, though wounded, stood tall and unwavering, its wings spread wide, casting a great shadow over the king and his soldiers. Elara could see the raw determination in the creature's golden eyes. It would not let Roderick take the crystal, no matter the cost. "You fool!" Roderick spat, regaining his composure as he lifted his sword once more. "You think a beast can stand in my way? I will cut you down and claim what is rightfully mine." The king charged again, his blade slicing through the air with a wicked hiss. Alien met him head-on, its talons flashing as it struck at Roderick with lightning speed. The two clashed in a furious dance of power, man against myth, steel against ancient magic. Each time Roderick swung his sword, Alien dodged with precision, countering with swift strikes that sent the king reeling. The soldiers, watching in awe, dared not intervene, for even they could see that this was no ordinary battle. Elara, standing back from the fight, felt her heart race with a mixture of fear and hope. She could see that Alien was growing weaker with each passing moment. The wound from the king's earlier strike still bled, dark and heavy, staining the griffin's golden feathers. But Alien fought with a strength that came not from physical might, but from purpose. The griffin was not merely defending itself, it was defending something far greater. the balance between magic and the mortal world. "Elara!" A voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned to see a small group of soldiers rushing toward her. Their swords were drawn, their eyes filled with fear and determination. They had seen the king falter, and now they sought to end the conflict by any means necessary. Elara's heart leapt into her throat. She had no weapon to match their steel, only the simple dagger her father had given her. But even as the soldiers closed in, something inside her refused to give in to fear. She couldn't let them distract Alien. She couldn't let them tip the scales in the king's favor. With a deep breath, Elara stepped forward to meet the soldiers. Her voice rang out, clear and strong. "Stop! The crystal of healing isn't meant for those who seek power through violence. If you take it, you will only bring ruin upon yourselves and the kingdom." The soldiers hesitated, their eyes flicking toward the Griffin and the king locked in battle. They had heard the legends, just like everyone else. They had seen Alien's might, and now, faced with the courage of a simple peasant girl, doubt began to creep into their hearts. But before they could act, the ground beneath them trembled. Alien let out a cry of pain as Roderick's sword sliced across its side, the dark magic of the blade searing the Griffin's flesh. The mighty creature faltered, its wings drooping as blood dripped onto the rocky ground. "Elara!" Alien's voice was a whisper in the wind, but she heard it as clearly as if the Griffin had spoken in her ear. The time had come. The crystal's fate, and the kingdom's, was in her hands. With a burst of resolve, Elara darted past the soldiers, racing toward the entrance of the cave where the crystal of healing lay hidden. She could feel its magic calling to her, a soft hum that resonated in her very bones. The soldiers shouted behind her, but she paid them no mind. She had to reach the crystal before Roderick did. She had to protect it. Roderick, seeing Elara's dash toward the cave, snarled in fury. "No, the crystal is mine!" He abandoned his battle with Alien, turning to chase after her. His soldiers moved to intercept, but Elara was quick, her feet light on the rocky ground as she slipped past them and into the cave's dark mouth. Inside, the air was cool and still. The walls of the cave glowed faintly with the light of the crystal, which sat upon a pedestal at the center of the chamber. Its light was soft yet radiant, casting a warm glow across the stone. Elara approached it, her breath coming in short gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the crystal's smooth surface. The moment her hand touched it, a surge of warmth flooded through her, filling her with a sense of peace and understanding. The crystal's power was pure, ancient, and untamable by greed or ambition. Elara knew now that it could not be taken by force. Only those with pure hearts could wield its magic. "Elara!" Roderick's voice echoed through the cave as he charged in, his sword raised. But Elara didn't flinch. She stood tall, the crystal's light bathing her in its glow. She was ready to face him, ready to protect what was never his to claim. The cave's cool air hummed with magic as Elara stood before the crystal of healing, its soft light bathing her in warmth and power. Behind her, King Roderick stormed into the chamber, his sword gleaming with dark magic, his face twisted with fury. The glow of the crystal illuminated his features, casting long shadows across his gaunt, angry face. "Step away from the crystal!" Roderick's voice echoed through the cave, his eyes wild with greed. His sword trembled in his hand, eager to strike, but the king hesitated. The magic in the cave was palpable, a force he could not fully understand. But that did not stop his hunger for the power he believed was his by right. Elara, her fingers still resting on the smooth surface of the crystal, did not move. The warmth of the artifact spread through her like a calm river, filling her with a deep sense of understanding. The crystal of healing wasn't simply a tool for mending wounds. It was alive with ancient magic, a force of balance and harmony. It could not be owned, controlled, or manipulated for selfish gain. In her heart, Elara knew that Roderick's ambition would destroy him if he tried to claim it. "I will not let you take this," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "This power isn't meant for a man like you." Roderick's sneer deepened, and he raised his sword, stepping closer. "What makes you think you can stop me, girl? You're nothing but a peasant, and I am a king. The crystal is mine by right." But Elara's courage did not waver. She knew that the crystal's true power could only be wielded by those who sought to protect and heal, not those who craved domination. She had seen the devastation the king's greed had wrought across the kingdom, the suffering of the people he claimed to rule. The crystal's magic had no place in his hands. "You don't understand its power," Elara said, standing her ground. "It will destroy you if you try to take it by force. The crystal chooses who is worthy, and it doesn't answer to greed." Roderick let out a bitter laugh, a hollow sound that echoed through the cave. "Do you think I fear magic? I will make it bend to my will, just as I have with everything else in my kingdom." With a roar of rage, Roderick lunged at Elara, his sword flashing through the air. But just as he brought the blade down, the crystal pulsed with a brilliant light, brighter than the sun, filling the cave with a blinding glow. Elara felt the surge of magic like a wave crashing over her, powerful and all-consuming. But it did not harm her. Instead, it wrapped around her like a protective shield, warm and pure. Roderick, however, staggered back, blinded by the light. His sword clattered to the stone floor, and he raised his hands to shield his eyes. The cave trembled as the crystal's power grew, its light intensifying, filling every crevice with its radiant energy. The air itself seemed to hum with the force of it, and Elara could feel the magic spreading, reaching beyond the cave, beyond the mountains, touching the very heart of the land. "Stop!" Roderick cried, stumbling backward. What is this?" Elara stepped forward, the crystal's light still flowing through her, giving her strength. "This is the power you sought," she said quietly. "But it was never yours to take." The light surged again, and this time, Roderick screamed. His body convulsed as the magic of the crystal, sensing the greed and corruption in his heart, began to turn against him. The darkness within him, his ambition, his hunger for power, was no match for the purity of the crystal's magic. The force of it twisted and warped around him, pulling at his very soul. "No!" he screamed, his voice high with terror. "I am the king! I command you!" But the crystal did not listen. Its light swirled around Roderick, burning away the darkness that clung to him, until all that was left was a hollow shell of a man who had once dreamed of ruling forever. His body crumpled to the ground, lifeless, his sword lying forgotten beside him. The cave grew still, the light of the crystal dimming once more to a soft glow. The air was heavy with the scent of magic and earth, but the danger had passed. Elara stood in the quiet, her heart pounding, her mind racing with what had just transpired. She looked down at Roderick's lifeless form, a pang of sadness filling her chest. Despite all he had done, she could not help but feel pity for him. In his greed, he had destroyed himself, blinded by the very power he sought to control. Behind her, a soft rustling sound caught her attention, and Elara turned to see Alien. The griffin had limped into the cave, its wings folded tightly against its sides, its golden eyes gleaming with both pain and pride. The creature's wounds were deep, but the light of the crystal had not only protected Elara, it had also begun to heal Alien's injuries. "You saved us," Elara whispered, her voice filled with gratitude as she approached the griffin. Alien lowered its great head, its eyes soft and knowing. The bond between them, forged in the heat of battle and sacrifice, was now unbreakable. Together they had protected the crystal, and with it the balance of magic and the kingdom itself. The battle for the artifact was over, and the true power of the crystal of healing had been revealed. The aftermath of the battle left the cave in a deep stillness, the only sound the soft hum of the crystal of healing, its light now calm and serene. Elara stood in its glow, her heart still racing from the events that had unfolded. The body of King Roderick lay motionless at her feet, his once powerful form now nothing more than a reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition. The cave, which had been a battleground only moments before, now felt like a sacred sanctuary. Beside her, Alien, the mighty griffin, lay down gently, breathing heavily but steadily. Though its wounds were severe, the crystal's magic had already begun to heal the creature. The griffin's golden eyes, still sharp and wise, met Elara's gaze, and she could feel the bond between them, one forged not by words, but by shared purpose. "You've done it," she whispered, kneeling beside the griffin, her hand resting lightly on its feathered neck. "We've done it." Alien let out a low, rumbling purr, a sound that filled Elara with warmth and relief. The griffin, once the solitary guardian of the crystal, was no longer alone. Together, they had protected the magic that balanced the world, and in doing so, had restored the peace that King Roderick had sought to shatter. As Elara stood, her gaze returned to the crystal of healing, glowing softly on its pedestal. She knew now that the artifact was more than just a tool for healing. It was a living force, one that responded to the purity, or corruption, of those who sought it. The crystal's magic could not be bent or controlled by selfish hands, and Roderick's downfall was proof of that. He had tried to seize its power for his own gain, and the crystal had rejected him, turning his greed against him. Elara approached the crystal slowly, her heart heavy with the weight of responsibility. She understood now why Alien had guarded it so fiercely, why the griffin had fought for centuries to keep it safe. The power within the crystal was too great to be left unprotected, too important to be misused. "Is this my duty now?" she asked softly, though she knew there was no one to answer but the wind and the magic that surrounded her. Alien stirred behind her, lifting its head as if sensing her thoughts. The griffin's eyes gleamed with understanding, and Elara knew in that moment that she was no longer an outsider in this sacred place. She had been chosen by the crystal, not through words or ceremony, but through her actions, through her courage, compassion, and her willingness to fight for what was right. "I will protect it," she whispered, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "I promise." As if in response, the crystal's light pulsed gently, a warm, reassuring glow that spread through the cave. Elara felt the magic wash over her, filling her with a deep sense of peace. She knew that this was not the end of her journey, but the beginning of a new one. The crystal and the balance it represented would always need guardians, those who would protect it from the greed of men like Roderick. Outside the cave, the sky had begun to brighten, the first rays of dawn breaking over the peaks of the Silver Mountains. The soldiers who had accompanied Roderick had long since fled, their spirits broken by the sight of their king's defeat. The battle was over, and the kingdom was safe, for now. Elara stepped out into the morning light, Alien at her side. The Griffin, though still healing, walked with pride and strength, its head held high. Together, they looked out over the valley below, where the sun's golden light bathed the land in warmth and promise. The world, once threatened by darkness and greed, seemed to breathe again, renewed by the magic that had been saved. "We should return," Elara said softly, though her heart was still heavy with the thought of all that had been lost. She knew the people of Eldon would need guidance in the wake of Roderick's fall. Without the king's oppressive rule, the kingdom would need to heal, just as Alien had begun to heal. But for now, the Griffin and the crystal were safe, and Elara, no longer the simple peasant girl she had once been, knew that she had a new path to follow.